Okay, sick guys. Here we go. Okay, welcome. Thank you for coming. This is week 2 of Marx, and today we're reading On the Jewish Question. It's probably my favorite work of Karl Marx. Just to give you a little bit of an introduction to it, it is a troubling read. It's titled On the Jewish Question. It trades in anti-Semitic stereotypes. It doesn't shy, there isn't a whole lot you could say about it. To defend it as far as like on that level. I will defend it at the very end, but I did, it's important to say at the outset that it's particularly disturbing at the end when he characterizes the Jew as the personification of greed and self-interest.
Wait, Jesus Christ.
We're gonna
This is
dive
Marx?
into that.
Isn't
This
he
is Karl
Jewish?
Marx.
Dude, Howard's so pumped right now.
So Karl Marx is Jewish. His father, so that this is, I spoke about this last week. His father renounced Judaism in order to practice law, because in the German state, Prussia at the time, not Germany yet, Prussia was a Christian state, and Jews were a second-class citizen. I'm going to go into all this. These are all questions that you should have. This is all exactly the point. But so the idea here is that I'm going to dive into the anti-Semitic stuff as we go through, but the real, like, the nuggets of wisdom that we can get from this have little to do with the question of Judaism. But I do, it is important to sort of talk about what that is. So like I said, at the same time, this text On the Jewish Question by Marx is one of the most important critiques of the Lockean conception of liberty ever written. And so we spent months basically talking about Locke and his influence on everything from the Black freedom struggle to Eugene Debs and the founding fathers. Locke is like very much in the DNA of America, and one of the greatest critiques of that strain of thought comes from Marx. It comes from this essay. So, like I said, it's possible to distill numerous valuable insights, notwithstanding the odiousness of its anti-Semitism. There's at least an argument to be made that the anti-Semitism is at most only tangential to the real wisdom of the piece. At the least, it maybe has nothing to do with it whatsoever. So what is the context? Oh, that's interesting. All my, oh, so it's going to go like this. It's okay. Interesting. I don't want any of that. I want you guys to see everything. So the context of the On the Jewish Question is that it's an essay that is a review of the German philosopher Bruno Bauer's 1842 series of articles on the Jewish emancipation in Germany, titled "The Jewish Question." So this guy, Bruno Bauer, he wrote a series of articles turned into a book titled "The Jewish Question" in Germany. And so the context of that is that the Jewish question is a sort of neutral expression for the negative attitude towards the apparent and persistent singularity of the Jews as a people, against the background of the rising political nationalism and new nation states. So what does this mean? Against the backdrop of the rising importance of the nation state, the rising importance of liberalism as a sort of underlying philosophy, rather than strict adherence to sort of like a kingly Judaism or a kingly sort of feudalism. There existed this sort of tension because Judaism was sort of understood at the time, and perhaps still is. Perhaps it's not wrong to say this. Judaism was sort of understood as a system of revealed law rather than a system of beliefs akin to another religion like Christianity. There's a sort of tension that arises when folks that are interested in statecraft, that are interested in the formation of a state, the formation of a people, a formation of a nation, you have to sort of account for the fact that if you have Jews in that group of people, they're going to be somewhat resistant, or they have a belief system or a system that they adhere to a separate set of laws than your state. And so again, I'm not trying to say that this is like necessarily true, but this was the question. This was the Jewish question: is can we have a liberal state? Can we have a state that is based on laws that also includes Jews, because they adhere to a different set of laws? A part of their personhood is to, recognize the Sabbath as a day of rest, right? They're not allowed to do anything, right? There's just a separate set of laws, and so there was the real question of like, are we going to be able to?
Don't raise your hand. You just got to speak up and ask questions.
No, I actually like the raise hand thing, but yeah. So Jeff, what's the question? Yeah.
Okay, I guess in terms of timeline, is this before like concepts of separation of church and state, or are we like pre this?
So this is right around that time. So this is like, so your internet connection seems a little faulty, but like the question is like, was this around the time of like the separation of church and state? Maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, the root of my question is like that his whole book's easily solved with just the separation of church and state.
Precisely.
So that's why okay. So that's why I'm asking, like, where are we at?
So this will basically be Bruno Bauer's argument. Is like we he goes a little bit further than like the American experience of like really just trying to divorce your own personal, like what you're up to as far as what you do with religion and church and stuff, separate that entirely from your citizen hat that you wear. Bruno Bauer goes further than that, and I want to talk about that. But it is right around this time when these questions are being asked. So the French Revolution happens about 50 years prior to this. The American Revolution happens about 50 years prior to this. So like these systems of like constitutional liberalism were popping up that were secular, right? They were sort of like, they weren't Christian. And in fact, they were, for as much as they were sort of underwritten by Christianity and like, so some folks might sort of critique it and say something like, well, Christianity is very much a part of the DNA of a lot of these sort of like Western liberal conceptions of constitutionalism and such, that's going on. But like the idea is that like we're trying to figure out the relationship between a person's religion and their state, right? And there's their citizen identity, and how much of that can we coexist together. So again, the Jews were a minority in Germany. And so when I say Germany, I mean Prussia, right? Because that's like the main German state that eventually goes on to become the sort of like driving force behind the unification of Germany. Bruno Bauer's is Prussian. Marx is Prussian. So like this is where this is all happening. The Jews were a minority in Germany. They were subject to a second-class citizenship. At the same time, they wielded significant financial power. They were restricted in commercial activities and occupational opportunities. Remember Marx's father, he had to convert in order to be a lawyer. So again, the question was whether Jews should be granted equal civil and political rights. The state was Christian. This is a Christian state in Prussia. And it was a question was like, well, should we allow Jews to like practice the same, enjoy the same political liberties that Christians do? Bruno Bauer argued that Christians and Jews could not enjoy equality until both renounced their religions. So that the path to Jewish emancipation was for Christians to renounce along with Jews, right? This is the secular liberal argument. This is the sort of like your personal religious affiliation should have nothing to do with your political status. This is Bruno Bauer's argument. We can think of the United States as an example of this, right? At least in theory, for like this idea in practice. So as a recap, for Bruno Bauer, emancipation is not enough. Jewish emancipation is not enough. Our goal should be political emancipation for all. That includes Christians renouncing their religion within the public sphere, right? You cannot go out into the public as a member of your state and talk about your Christianity. Just as we're not going to allow Jews to do that too, right? And so Bruno Bauer's argument is to sort of like have that be a complete separate thing. Another way to think about this, I don't know, I wish it wasn't like that. Another way to think about this is like in the Christian German state, no one was free. And without being free oneself, one cannot help another to freedom, right? So this is something that Bauer says. He says, like, Jews, you're asking us Christians, he's not Christian, you're asking the Christians for like to enjoy the same liberty that they do, but look, they're not free either. They're they don't experience the same political freedom that like those in America might experience, right? We need to have a secular state. That's what Bruno Bauer. As long as any religion received any kind of public recognition, even by a particular faith being designated the religion of the majority, a religious minority would be invariably oppressed. This was the idea. So the idea here, if you wanted to sort of place this argument within modern controversies around, religious states and like secular states and things like this, Bruno Bauer would be an advocate of the one secular state solution, right? Not a one state solution, which is usually meant to say something like, we're going to only allow Jews to live in Israel. But Bruno Bauer would say something like, you Jews and you Palestinians are going to coexist under a secular government, right? That's what Bruno Bauer would argue for.
Well, but hold on, dude. I
What's
gotta
up?
like call bullshit on all of this
Okay.
because that all makes a lot of sense. I hate to say what you're saying makes a lot of sense. The secular state, I obviously strongly believe in, like this, to Jeff's point, the separation of church and state, and like, okay, cool, we can solve for Marx's, extreme racism through these like new thinkers, but how do we discount that as like a fundamental, like, okay, cool, so we can say this Bauer guy is neat, and we can say that like the United States has created some really phenomenal concepts around the separation of church and state, but at his core, like, Marx is like this racist piece of shit. And
You don't know that yet. I haven't given you enough information for you to make that claim.
Yes,
yet.
you have. You
just hold on to it. Hold on to it. I have. Maybe I shouldn't have led with that. I don't want you to think about that yet. I just wanted to state at the outset. Yes, the title of the essay.
Okay, but hold on, and I'll shut up and I'll let you continue after this. But
okay,
what would you say to me? Let me just like play devil's advocate.
Okay.
What would you say to me if I was like, listen, you guys, and I know this is hyperbole, right? I get this is a little bit of an exaggeration compared to what Marx just said. But if I was like, listen, you guys, there was this dude named Hitler, and he like literally committed genocide and single-handedly was responsible for mass murdering like an entire race of people. But here's the deal. He had some really cool ideas about public transportation. And I think we just need to like put aside his mass murdering for a little bit, because he really needs to be honored as like a scion of modernizing.
I won't be making that argument. Don't worry. I will not. What I'm trying to do is not discount the anti-Semitism, but I will give it enough space to breathe, and we can talk about it. But I haven't even told you what Marx has said yet. I like literally have not. That was all I've talked about so far was Bruno Bauer. Bruno Bauer's essay was, you Jews and you Christians shouldn't.
No, you did tell me what Marx said. You said Marx questioned whether or not Jews could integrate into society because they had religious.
No. That was like everybody was questioning that. That was the hotbed issue of the time in Germany. It's like, should we allow Jews into like political society? That was everybody was saying that. Everybody was saying that. So Bauer says like, no, we shouldn't allow Jews into political society because we don't even have one. We have a Christian society. You Christians need to denounce your bullshit, and the Jews need to denounce their bullshit, and then we can actually do politics, because we can't let religion get in the way of all this. That's what Bruno Bauer says. So Marx reads this and has something to say about it, right? Marx's answer to this, Marx's response to Bruno Bauer, is that political emancipation isn't enough. It's not enough to renounce religion. It's not even enough to have political freedom. Our goal should be human freedom. Our goal should be human emancipation, not political emancipation. Who gives a fuck about voting and being a liberal or whatever? Our goal is human freedom. And so there's almost nothing about that argument that has anything to do with Judaism, right? And so like, again, that's what I wanted to, that's like the immediate response, but like, we're going to go into more detail about it. So political emancipation is not enough. Our goal is human emancipation. The modern state, the liberal state, is another form of alienation. Political emancipation is a false promise. The quote here from Marx is that here we find Bauer's mistake. Bruno Bauer makes a big mistake. He subjects only the Christian state and not the state as such to criticism, in failing to examine the relationship between political emancipation and human emancipation. So he wants to sort of like get us out of this argument that we've been having. It's not about Jews versus Christians or Jews and Christians versus the state. It's literally not about that at all. It's literally just about the state versus human beings. There's actually a more fundamental unfreedom happening. That's way more important than like your religious squabbles. That's where Marx takes us to.
A quick question is are we still talking like systemically, or are they looking at it like the state is more or less a perpetrator, if that makes sense?
Systemically. So it's
Okay.
it's not like the sort of like police that Marx has in mind. It's not the sort of like overt forms of power that you might think about when you think about.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
It's this idea of liberalism itself, and so we're going to talk about this in a second.
Cool,
So
thank
this
you.
and that's a great question, because what Marx does here is he levies a critique at social contract theorists such as Locke, Rousseau. We haven't read some of the others, but at the backdrop of all this was this idea, these new ideas of liberalism, these social contract ideas. The state exists to serve me, an individual, and protect my rights, i.e. my property, right? That's liberalism. And Marx has this, that's the crosshair for Marx. And so again, what does he have in mind? He has in mind what Bauer has in mind when he says political emancipation. He has in mind the French Revolution. We're going to throw off the chains of our oppressors, the kings and queens, the feudalism, all these sort of like the ancient regime, all these ways of doing things. We're going to throw it off, and we're going to form our new constitution in the guise of the Americans did this. They had a great time doing it. We should do it ourselves. Look, the French did it. Let's just not worry about what happened shortly after the French did it, but we should do it ourselves. The Germans should do it, right? This is what Bauer has in mind. So just to give you guys a little refresher on the French Revolution, there was like a very brief period of time over the course of a few months where the kings and queens and the entire system of feudalism basically fell at the hands of something basically like democracy. It's like a really remarkable moment in history. Normally these things start in stops and starts, and this one actually was stops and starts because the king ended up coming back. But the idea is that like it's a real sort of flashpoint moment where brand new ideas come to the scene and like actually take political force. So the national delegates, they demand a constitution in June 20th of 1789. The national delegates are essentially just like a group of commoners, which was like a brand new idea. This is not something that was allowed at the time. It was like your feudal lords were the ones that were coming to court, right? If you think Game of Thrones, the folks that are like hanging around in the kings and queen court are not the regular rabble, right? It's the folks that have landed property. They're important, right? The national delegates in France were just your random punters, and they demanded a constitution. And at this sort of like at some of these like early meetings, this is actually where we get the left and right spectrum. When we say somebody's left wing or somebody's right wing, we get that language from this moment in history when folks were coming into a room and they stood on opposite sides of the room to discuss whether or not they were going to support the king or support something new, right? The supporters of the king, the supporters of feudalism were the ones on the right side of the room, and the revolutionaries, the ones that wanted liberalism, the wanted to form a new constitution, they were the ones on the left. And that's where we get that. We didn't have that idea before then. So again, they weren't granted this. They said we wanted a constitution. They weren't granted that, so they stormed the Bastille, which is a sort of like prison that was It was basically a symbol of the ancient regime. It was a symbol of like the long-lasting feudalism. There weren't any like actual prisoners in the Bastille. It wasn't really a storehouse for ammunition or anything. It was literally just like a sort of like a symbol more than anything.
Is it ironic that Bastille Day is a big military celebration now?
Maybe. Well, I mean, there were a lot of like, it was basically it was a storming. It was like war, you know. There was defenders of it. There were folks that were like seizing arms and seizing cannons and things like that, and you know, a lot of people died. It is sort of like the French are really funny, you know. They like, it seems like it is a sort of national holiday that everyone sort of supports, but like you know, the history of it is interesting. It's like there was at least, you know, a large portion of folks that weren't supporting that going on, you know. It's just sort of interesting. So anyway, so the result of this is that they abolish feudalism and they institute a constitution. The ultimate result of that is the terror and Robespierre and folks getting their heads cut off and stuff like that. But we don't have to get into that today. But so we get the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which is like France's like counterpart to the Bill of Rights. These are documents that you know, for the first time in history, sort of lay down rights as we conceive of them, as sort of like individual holdings, not granted by your lord, not granted by your sort of political unit that you ascribe to, granted to you by God or by nature, right? It's like comes to you naturally. And so you know, that idea, which is a central tenet of liberalism, you know, comes from this period. But again, I have this up here to tell you what Bruno Bauer has in mind. You know, this is what he has in mind when he says political emancipation. He wants this for Germany. Marx's critique of this shows, and this is a sort of introduction to it, and we'll get into more detail. It shows the sort of hollowness of that type of political emancipation. Because the liberal state claims to emancipate its citizens by granting them equal and political rights. But political emancipation does not bring freedom to our actual lives. This is in Marx's words, right? The liberal state creates two separate realms. The political realm, where we are granted things like freedom. The French, you know, the famous rallying cries of the French Revolution: liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, freedom. We are granted these in the political realm, Marx says, but in civil society, what I might call the market, what Marx has in mind when he says civil society is like your everyday life, your day-to-day life. You don't experience liberty in your day-to-day life, your everyday life. You experience a profound unfreedom. You don't experience equality in your everyday life, in society, in the market. You experience inequality. And you don't experience fraternity in civil society. You experience antagonism. And so again, the liberal state claims to emancipate claims to emancipate us by granting us political rights. But our actual lives are shot through with the antecedents to these, the complete opposite of these liberal rights of man. That's the argument in brief. I want to get into more detail. So again, I thought this was about religion. This isn't about Judaism. I thought the title of the essay was on the Jewish question. What is he doing talking about this? What is the religious thing? I thought Marx was against religion, right? Isn't this essay a critique of religion? It's more complicated than that. You know, Marx is responding to Bruno Bauer, who we can more accurately say is the anti-religious fellow here, right? Bruno Bauer is the one that is sort of like, he's got flames in his mouth, sort of talking down religion. Marx has a more sort of nuanced view of these things. What does Marx think about religion? You know, the very famous phrase, you know, religion is the opium of the people. You know, the full expression is religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. Opium is the solution, not the problem. This is the Alcoholics Anonymous diagnosis of addiction, right? And so what is the problem that we're trying to solve with opium or with religion? You know, that's really what Marx is more worried about. He's not worried about abolishing religion because he thinks it's going to solve some problem. He knows that people seek religion for a reason. They seek it because they don't have meaning in their lives. They don't have, they experience a profound longing for something spiritual, and they don't get it from their day-to-day lives. They don't get it here on earth because we're doing something wrong. That's like, he doesn't say anything like that in brief, but that's my gloss on it so far. Howard, where your thoughts are yet? What's going on?
I don't know, dude. I think I'm too dumb to like reconcile all of that together, if you want me to be honest. Like,
Okay, maybe by the end.
yeah, no, keep going. I mean, yeah, keep going.
What were you gonna say?
Hey, Brian, can you talk about is he saying specifically, just to build on last week's topic, he's talking about opium is the religion is our opium, our solution
to alienation,
to alienation from our creativity, which leaves us with a painful separation.
So he doesn't have that. He doesn't have that traced out in any paper or any essay, any book. I think you could write a really good. You could write a great political theory article saying that's a.
So what is our problem? What is our problem? I guess. What is the problem?
Well, I think you have it right. He doesn't. So I'm not saying he doesn't not say that. This is the task of the scholar, is to sort of like make insights based on what we're given.
He's just, okay. And so he's just lumping in hardcore Judaism with every other, in his mind, opium for a problem that is actually a problem of other solutions, not religion. That's what his view is of Judaism.
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, or just religion in general.
It's like just another dumb religion.
Yeah, he does sort of single out Judaism at the end, and it's important that it's at the end. I do want to make it at the end. He doesn't forefront this idea, but yeah, Judaism is particularly unique. But he has it in mind when he says religion. When he says the opium of the people, it's certainly up in there. And I think you're right. I think that's a really like nice insight that like that we seek religion to solve some problem, to solve the problem of longing.
Well,
I want to believe that it was just a really poorly timed opinion.
As far as like
well, just like,
so you're wondering if he's like influencing like the Nazi regime or something like that.
I mean, just like being around.
No, I hear what you're saying, Mav.
It's sensitive. It's sensitive, and like I agree with his opinion, but like maybe like too soon kind of thing.
No, I think what Mav's, if I may, Maverick,
Sure.
I think what Maverick's saying is that he perhaps it isn't that Marx is so much an anti-Semite. It's that he existed in a time where this was like the zeitgeist.
It's true.
And perhaps he had not yet the critical thinking to examine the extraordinary racism and damaging nature of that thought hadn't like come to the forefront of society yet. And so perhaps not excusing Marx's anti-Semitic, and these aren't my words, I'm just trying to paraphrase Maverick.
Yeah.
Perhaps not excusing Marx's anti-Semitism, but saying that like, hey, we have to keep in context that maybe he's not so anti-Semitic as he just was kind of like operating under the status quo, and he didn't shine the magnifying glass on this one yet. Is that what you're kind of saying, Maverick, or am I getting that wrong?
That's pretty close. I'm saying that he's not anti-Semitic, he's anti-religion.
Sure.
Yeah, that's a much more common. Sorry.
Looking back on him, because of the era, Or like that wasn't a good view to have. You know, we can easily say, oh, he's an anti-Semite because of the Nazis.
Well, but hold on though. Didn't Brian, and again, I'm not fighting the anti-Semitic fight right now. I want to hear
Yeah.
more. But Brian, you did say specifically that he did single out Judaism. And
Yeah,
so I don't
and I
think
wanted,
it's fair to ignore
so not
that.
yet in the essay. Everything I've told you so far, this is all chronological. I've like only told you he will eventually do something interesting, which I don't think is controversial to say is anti-Semitic.
Got
But
it.
it has
Okay.
nothing to do with the argument so far, you know?
I appreciate you. I mean, I appreciate you being honest with that and not trying to fucking like wholesale defend Marx.
Yeah, I don't want to, do that. But I, nevertheless, I do agree. We said the same thing about Aristotle. If you remember, one of our first meetings, we said, Aristotle, look, he's sexist and he's racist
About the slaves? Yeah.
about the
yes.
slaves. And Marx
Sure.
is guilty of, just as everybody, we're all guilty of doing this
So
thing.
let me ask you this then, and I don't want to. Why is it that we're so quick academically to, maybe rightfully so, maybe not rightfully so, but why is it that we're so quick academically to, I don't know if I'd say justify, but to kind of put aside some of Marx's reprehensible tendencies and ideas in order to shine the larger light on his, what you believe to be, really large and beneficial intellectual achievements. Yet when that same litmus test is applied to numerous members of in American history, it's like bring out the pitchforks and the torches, because these horrific slave owners need to, their descendants need to pay reparations now, right? Like,
I thought I was really fair to Madison and Jefferson, and I thought I did
I
a
guess
good job.
I'm not speaking about you specifically. I'm more talking about like the general like leftist zeitgeist right now
Okay.
in America.
Okay, several things to say. First thing, in the academy, in the sort of bourgeois academy, you're not learning about this stuff. Nobody is teaching you Marx in any in any sort of top university, except in like the corners of an English department, maybe. This stuff is roundly rejected by like the sort of like
roundly
mainstream,
rejected in the sense. Hold on,
by the
roundly
mainstream
rejected.
academy.
Wait, hold on. Clarify that. Roundly rejected in the sense that like they cover up his anti-Semitism, or roundly
No,
rejected in the sense that they dislike his ideas
that they
completely?
don't want to talk about Marx at all.
Dude, I'm not sure if that's
There
true,
is a
bro.
there is a leftist movement in certainly where
Dude,
it's not like I'm the only guy reading Marx. I know that.
I'm telling you, Brian, my own experience at not even a fancy college, at CSU Dominguez Hills, proves otherwise. I literally had
I think at like community college, some like state and like community colleges. I'm just saying, like, once I got to like a sort of like tweed wearing, university, everybody just like shut the fuck up about Marx, and they were like, oh, we have to like, that wasn't, or like they're like afraid or something. So okay, so to answer your question like more directly, you're wondering like why are we spending time talking about this? Like it sounds like I'm defending, and like I just have to sort of throat clear.
No, I guess I was just I guess I was just like airing out a grievance with what I perceive to be like this general double standard with like progressive thought and the mistakes that some of their intellectual scions have made versus everyone else.
There is a melancholy on the left. There's a profound melancholy and sadness on the left, because they look around and they recognize that they lost. And so I think that there is a sort of quickness to sort of dismiss and be critical of figures that they perceive to be to be the figures that won, and defend and try and like
okay,
unearth,
that's fair. That makes sense.
And try and unearth wisdom that we have long since buried, that maybe we were too quick to. That there is a very that's a something that motivates a lot of people, I'd say, is like this sort
Okay.
of sadness and sort of reflectiveness about a lost future that we just didn't pull it off, you know.
Okay.
And so yeah,
But,
they're
I mean,
gonna
that makes sense.
but also, I just want to point out that, like, you know, we started talking about this specific argument. We were talking about Aristotle and slaves, and Jefferson and Madison and slaves, and
Yeah.
we had kind of been all about, you know, and the way that their bodies are built for that purpose, and
Right.
all of these weird beliefs that they had around that time.
Mhm.
And we had this same exact question about them, and I think it's just a little bit, I don't know. I think it's not the whole picture to say that the leftists are the ones who are. I think everybody who goes and looks at Aristotle and says and sees the things that he's writing about those particular issues has to be like, well, I can't discount everything else Aristotle said because of his weird, what we now perceive to be obviously incorrect views. And that was kind of where we ended up with
Yeah.
those teachers also. I mean, and Marx is obviously a super controversial figure, and you saying he's roundly rejected in America, I believe that for sure, especially because, you know, how demonized he has become here in our country.
Mhm.
But like, I guess my point is, when looking at any scion from
Yeah.
any side of the aisle, we have to kind of be like, well, you know, but he also tortured people, or well, you know, he also was an anti-Semite, or well, you know, there's throat clearing
Yeah.
all the way back to, you know, any progressive thought leader of their time, you know. And I just think that's important to say. It's like, it's not just this dude, it's every single one of them
That's true.
has some skeletons in the closet that any scholar of the opposite thought will dig up and
Use
utilize
as a-
against.
yeah.
100%.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense.
So I've kind of harped on this a million times. Just a reminder, Marx's idea is that the abolition of religion, which is what Bauer wants us to abolish religion in order to have a truly secular, free, political, wonderful state. Marx says you're not going to get there by abolishing religion, because you might get political freedom, but that's not the freedom that is actually going to like solve a problem on a human level. Political emancipation from religion is not complete and consistent emancipation from religion, because political emancipation is not complete and consistent form of human emancipation. So he like takes it out of this sort of like religious, political level and brings it to humans. He says there's something else going on here. It's human emancipation, human freedom. So we're still left with this underlying problem. You know, once we abolish religion, it's akin to going dry, right? We're going to be white knuckling it. Religion won't do it. We already know that Marx thinks politics won't do it, but let's see how he gets there. First, he wants us to think about our lives and our associations across a distinction, right? On one hand is our political life. On the other hand is civil society. This is what happens to us in the modern liberal state, is that we get separated. We get sort of divorced from ourselves. It is not necessarily distinct in nature, but modern life looks like this to Marx. And he would think that we would agree with it. What does he mean by this? In the political community, right? So I'll actually read the passage. It's really important. Right. By its nature, the perfected political state is man's species life in opposition to his material life. All the presuppositions of this egoistic life remain in civil society outside the state. But as qualities of civil society, where the political state has achieved its full development, like in America or something like that, man leads a double life, a heavenly and earthly life, not only in thought consciousness, but in actuality. In the political community, he regards himself as a communal being. In civil society, he is active as a private individual. He treats other men as means, and he reduces himself to means, and becomes the plaything of alien powers. The political state is spiritual in relation to civil society as heaven is in relation to earth. It stands in the same opposition to civil society and goes beyond it in the same way as religion goes beyond the limitation of the profane world. That is, by recognizing, reestablishing, and necessarily allowing itself to be dominated by it. In his innermost actuality, in civil society, man is a profane being. Here, where he counts as an actual individual to himself and others, he is an illusory phenomenon. In the state where he counts as a species being, on the other hand, he is an imaginary member of an imagined sovereignty, divested of his actual individual life and endowed with an unactual universality. So again, whenever I speak like that, I think that like nobody's hearing or understanding what I'm saying. But I think the picture that I have up on the screen here like gets really close to what the idea here is, that like we have two lives. We live a double life in modern society. We have this sort of what Marx calls his species life. We have this sense of ourselves as a communal being outside of ourselves. We think of ourselves as a member of a political community. And so we go vote, right? We have these ideals. We have these sort of heavenly, Marx ascribes it to a sort of religious, spiritual type of existence. It's outside of ourselves. It's not material. It's not a part of our bodies. But yet, after we cast our ballot, we go home and we are subjected to like the most brutal and unfree forms of exploitation. This is the contradiction at the heart of this class's fascination with the word liberty, right? We claim we have liberty and our freedom. And what we mean when we say that is we can speak and vote how we want, right? Marx would say that we are politically free, but in the arena where our lives, like on the day-to-day level, where they actually matter, where our lives actually sort of present to us as real, our lives are subject to sustained and brutal unfreedom, certainly inequality, and the opposite of fraternity. Liberty, equality, fraternity is not our sort of day-to-day lives, right? That's the argument for Marx. And so,
Wait, can you? Okay, I know you just.
Yeah.
Can you state that? TLDR, dumb it down for me.
Yeah. So he's saying that like in the world in which he wants us to live, we would not have this sort of separated sense of our lives. We would not have the sort of like individualistic pursuit of my own passions and desires at home and in the market and on my day-to-day life and the things I think about all the time. But then like one time out of every 6 months or every 2 years, maybe, we tend to think of ourselves as belonging to something bigger than ourselves, right? And so we go and we like act politically, we vote or whatever, right? He says that when we are granted political freedom, like we are given the right to vote, we are not given actual freedom, because the realm in which we would experience freedom is being dominated by an economic system that keeps us productive towards some end that is not our own, right? That would be the idea. And so we have this split life that's sort of like, and so he has this like really great phrase. Even when we go and vote and we do our political freedoms and stuff like that, we're only an imagined member of an imagined sovereignty, divested of my actual individual life and endowed with an unactual universality.
Has he made the distinction yet that that's because of capital, or is this still?
You can read into that, of course, by this point that that's what he has in mind.
Okay.
He's still young, so this is actually, he wrote this before the book that we read last week. And so he really doesn't even have the word capitalism in mind yet. He'll go on, he'll say,
well, that's what I was going to say. Could this just be like the pining of like a disenfranchised youth who feels like disconnected from humanity and society?
He's very young right now. Yeah, he could be. Yeah, he's like 22, I think.
Okay.
And he hasn't done his sort of like thorough examination of political economy. He hasn't read a bunch of like Hume and Smith and David Ricardo. He hasn't done his like his advanced studies in political economy, but he's still very much a humanist. Like that's the sort of driving factor here. He's like, he sort of wants to free people, and like he sees unfreedom around him. I could have put a picture of like a 19th century, textile factory, right? Maybe that would have gotten the idea better
Sure.
for him. But for us, I think this is what we think of when we think of what he's after here, is that like, these folks are going to like imagine themselves as a member of the United States and like adhering to something like that. And then they go and they work at the Amazon sweatshop, It's
Yeah.
sort of like, it's a funny juxtaposition for Marx, and I think for us too.
Sure.
So one of the interesting parts about this work is that he kind of gives me, and I think other people, a way of thinking about things that's that I think has a lot of legs behind it. I don't even know how to describe it. It's sort of I don't know. Sometimes I think Maverick gets upset at me sometimes when I'm like speaking about some things and I like kind of divert or like ask a different question than the question that I was asked instead of answering or something like that. Marx, I think, gives people this idea by doing what he does here, because what he's going to do is he's going to critique the liberal state, and in particular the liberal rights, right? The sort of rights of man that the French Revolution gave us, or the Bill of Rights or something like that. But he's not going to do it on their terms. He's going to do it on his own terms. And it's a sort of, I think it's an interesting way to do it. So I'll just read the passage that I have selected here a bits of. What he says the political elevation of man above religion shares all the defects and all the advantages of any political elevation. If the state, as state, for example, abolishes private property, man proclaims private property is overcome politically. Once he abolishes the property qualification for active and passing voting, as he has done in many North American states. So he has this, like in America, we did away with this idea that you have to own property in order to vote, right? That was a big moment for us. We said like, you know what, we're going to let the really poor people vote too. And Marx looks at this. Marx has this in mind when he's saying this. He says, Hamilton interprets this fact quite correctly. Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton interprets this fact quite correctly in political terms. The great majority of the people, this is Hamilton's quote, have gained a victory over property owners and financial wealth. Back to Marx. Is not private property ideally abolished when the have-nots come to legislate for the haves? The property qualification is the last political form for recognizing private property. So he's saying like, yeah, this is great. Like we're like allowing poor people into the political sphere. Yet the political annulment of private property not only does not abolish it, but it presupposes it.
Wait. The political annulment
of private property not only does not abolish it, but it presupposes it. So what you do as a state, like I will read what he has to say here, but what he says is like, you, the state, you, the folks behind writing the Constitution and stuff like that, you're going to say you don't need a property qualification to vote. Guess what you just did? You just concretized property as like something that is embedded within the very structure of society. You could have actually abolished it, right? But when you say that it's not a part of your liberal state, we're not gonna recognize private property as a qualification. You presuppose private property. You make sure that it exists. And so that's sort of strange, right? Why does he say that? He says the state abolishes distinctions of birth, rank, education, and occupation in its fashion when it declares them to be non-political distinctions. When it proclaims that every member of the community equally participates in popular sovereignty without regard to these distinctions, and when it deals with all the elements of the actual life of the nation from the standpoint of the state. Nevertheless, the state permits private property, education, and occupation to act and manifest their particular nature as private property, education, and occupation in their own ways. Far from overcoming these factual distinctions, the state exists only by presupposing them. It is aware of itself as a political state and makes its universality effective only in opposition to these elements. So that's like,
dude, I was
a bit
trying
out there.
so hard to follow you and like.
I'm aware it's a bit out there,
but I just couldn't. Can you?
It's a bit out there. Does anybody get that idea?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think so. I
please.
think I got it. I think it. So by saying that we are no longer requiring private property to be a requirement for you to vote, we are entrenching the very idea of private property even further. That it is a
Yes.
fundamental law of
Oh,
the
no, no,
universe
okay, well, hold
that
on.
we are no
I
longer
underst-
requiring.
I understand that he's saying that, but what the
Okay.
fuck? That doesn't make any sense.
It just doesn't track for you.
It does. I'm
Right,
like, that's
because
just not.
because you believe that private property is a given in the world.
Yeah,
That's
right.
And he does not. And he does not.
That's precisely it. That's the disagreement
Okay,
here.
got it,
And
got it,
like,
got
and
it.
He's
Marx
like
is,
going.
Got it.
He's going beyond. He's going
Got
beyond
it.
the
Okay,
idea of
cool.
the state or the individual, and he's talking about like the fucking
The
molecules
fundamental
of
concept. Okay,
yes, of owning the
Okay.
T-shirt you're wearing being silly.
got it. Okay, cool. Thank you.
That's
super-
exactly
Like
right.
that
Okay.
shirt is just here in the world, and so are you. The idea that you own it is something that
damn.
we made up and agree on.
What's up,
Okay.
Brett?
Got it.
What's up?
That.
Brett wanted to join. He was jealous.
Yeah, hell
I'm
yeah, I
sitting
love
next to
that.
him.
Hey, Brett. That makes
Hey,
that makes.
hey,
I mean,
Brett.
I'm not saying
What's
that
up?
that's
Stoked to be
like
part of the discourse.
that makes a lot more sense. Thank you. I
Yeah,
didn't. You're
and
right.
it's
You're right,
disagreeable,
Maverick.
Howard. You know, it's
no, it's just and I'm not even like talking shit. I just that wasn't even like
okay, cool.
I couldn't even track that because I don't because Maverick's right. That's so
He's just basically he's basically spitting the fire as shit. And you know, Eckhart Tolle then took this idea and wrote like a bunch of books about it and got on Oprah. That's what's going on right now.
Oh, got it. Okay, thank you. Of course.
So he does this same exact thing with every other like liberal right of man. And so he does it like this. He said, you know, oftentimes so-called political emancipation, political freedom, granting of rights to freedom, property, expression, etc. They have the effect of concretizing, reifying, presupposing freedom, property, expression, etc. And so those two words, concretizing or reifying, those are very Marxist terms. Like Marx gave us this idea that
Can you say those terms again? What are those terms? I've never heard those words.
These are
so slower.
There's a it's just funny because like there's like actually a huge debate about these terms. Like, does they actually come from Marx, or this is all just like scholars after the fact attributing, you know, like creating something that really wasn't there. But like it is true that Marx gives us this basic idea that in progress, that something exists, something doesn't exist possibly until like the state or an ideology or some sort of like something that Marx might call an alien plaything or an alien power, like creates it and we think it's real. And so that's what the idea of reifying was, one of the terms I used. Reifying, it's like it's the process of like making something appear real when it actually isn't, right? When it actually is the construct of the state or an ideology or an economic system or whatever, right? Reifying, so famously, a Marxist would say something like capitalism reifies competition between people or something like that. Like, you know, there's any number of things that you could say that like Marx gives us this idea that like our ideas are not our own, right? They were given to us. They were sort of, it's an inception process, right? Marx is the first one to sort of like broach that topic in the sort of like, I mean, Plato obviously everybody's can find something in Plato that reminds them of anything else. But like the idea that Marx gives us is that it's happening in sort of like modern life in this way. And so I use the words concretizing and reifying because they're really popular academic words to describe this process of like implantation of an idea and like making the person thinking it think that they thought about it or think that it's real, that it's a necessary aspect of life or of science or of whatever.
So he's basically saying that
Plato's concept of recollection is really a mark of somebody else giving that to you?
Oh, no. My idea, so like I said that Marx was the first one to think of this, and then I was like, wait, that's not actually true. Anything that you can
Okay.
say, like the first person to think of it, it was probably Plato.
Yeah, it's bad.
That was my aside there.
Okay.
But like,
So that like spun me out. I was like, no, I was
whoa,
like
whoa, whoa.
overcomplicating it. Okay, I get it now. We're good.
Yeah.
We're good.
So anyway, so political emancipation, again, political emancipation is a fraud comparable to the fraud of religion. It leaves our actual lives unfree, conflictual, unhappy. Moreover, it teaches us, as Howard, as our example from Howard, maybe, it teaches us to accept our unhappy existence as the inevitable result of human nature. We end up accepting our unfree property, distribution, our unfree claimants to property, our unequal claimants to property, our unfree sort of economic situation, whatever. It teaches us to accept these as inevitable consequences of human nature. That's what political rights do to us. By sort of saying that the right, the rights of man, we're not going to have age, sex, or occupation be have anything to do with your political rights. Your political rights are yours and you only yours, and you have a right to life, freedom, and property. By doing all this, what it does is it sort of implants this idea into our mind that our unhappy existence is the inevitable consequence, or it's our fault, right? This is a deception, right? Marx says this is a deception. The political rights, the rights of man, the backbone of liberalism, turn out to not only be empty promises, but they also hinder human freedom. How could that be so? I'll explain that in a second. But this idea of the political lion skin, this is a very famous expression that gets at this idea that like the rights of man, the things you get on the paper, on the Constitution, they're actually just a political lion skin. That's Marx uses that phrase here on this page. And people like write a book about this idea. Our political lion skin is like the laws that we have on the books. They don't actually give us freedom or property or whatever. They just
Hey
sort
guys,
of
I gotta take a quick call, but I'll be back.
Okay, so yeah. Anyway, so again, so the question then is like they turn out to not only be empty promises, but they also hinder human freedom. And so what does he have in mind here? He does this really fun thing where he brings up like all the rights of man. First, he has in mind liberty, right? We might call it freedom, something like that, right? But so in Article 6 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man of 1789, right, 2 years before 1791 or something, Article 6 says liberty is the power which man has to do everything that does not harm the rights of others, right? The liberty of non-interference, freedom of non-interference, right? That's what liberty is to the French who engaged in the French Revolution. Liberty consists in being able to do everything which does not harm others. That's liberty for the liberal, right? So what does Marx say about this? Marx says, liberty is thus the right to do and perform anything that does not harm others. This is the liberty of man viewed as an isolated monad, withdrawn into himself. Liberty as a right of man is not based on the association of man with man, but rather on the separation of man from man. It is the right of this separation, the right of the limited individual limited to himself. Liberty becomes this like right to be lonely, an isolated monad withdrawn into yourself. That's what he has to say about the rights of liberty, right? The sort of like thing that we think is fundamental to like a free society, right? He says it's the right of isolation. It is the right of this separation, the right of the limited individual limited to himself. And so he does the same thing to property. What constitutes man's right to private property? Article 16 of the French Constitution. The right of property is that which every citizen has of enjoying and of disposing at his discretion of his goods and income, of the fruits of his labor and industry. What does Marx have to say? He says the right of property is thus the right to enjoy and dispose of one's possessions as one wills, without regard for other man and independently of society. It is the right of self-interest. It lets every man find in other man not the realization, but rather the limitation of his own freedom. So property becomes the right which restricts freedom. Freedom and property are incompatible rights. You can't have a constitution that gives somebody freedom and at the same time allows for private property. Because it's within private property that you find not the realization, but the limitation of your freedom. That's where you find where your freedom ends at some other man's property. How could you have these two conflicting ideas in the same document? What are you guys' thoughts about that? That's like pretty
Well, yeah, I mean, I think giving us the rights to manifest our destiny, and on one hand, right, kind of, right, buy property, make it become mine. This idea of mine, right, is if unchecked. I guess what I'm saying is obvious. They like wrote this document giving us these freedoms, but they were like, well, but if we let that go unchecked, like then it's going to impinge on other people's freedom. So we have to have some regulation, So I guess I just view it as like when was, I'm sorry, I get all confused about the timelines.
Yeah.
Was this written after the?
Yeah. So Marx is here. So like I literally like the words I have on the page are like copied and pasted from the article. So he's quoting the French Constitution, which came out like 50 years before this.
Okay.
And he's saying like, this is the freedom that you guys are all up in arms with. This is the thing that you guys love, right? Freedom, property.
Right.
This, and then this
freedom
is what
as
I
long
think
as it doesn't. Right. Freedom as long as it doesn't touch another man's freedom.
Right. And then what Marx says about that is that's what you're doing right there is you're making sure that you have a society of isolated nomads withdrawn into yourself, right? Wow. Liberty as the right of man is not based on the association of man with man, but rather on the separation of man from man. It is the right of this separation, the right of the limited individual withdrawn unto himself. And then again with property, the right of property is thus the right to enjoy and dispose of one's possessions as one wills without regard for other man and independently of society. It is the right of self-interest. It lets every man find in other man not the realization, but the limitation of his own freedom. Property is the signposts that we put up around ourselves to make sure that we are unfree. That's Marx's gloss on the right of property.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do I even say my question or comment on that? So it seems to me like what he's really arguing is that the relationship to the system is different. Where Marx is saying that we're not independent of the system. And I think the Constitution is the French Constitution is mostly defining people as independent from the system, to say that your liberty is just you and don't harm your neighbors and you're good, right? And like your property is yours, use it at your own discretion. I think what Marx is really trying to say, or at least I'm reading it as this, is that we can't have this individual freedom or this individual property without consequences, or that's actually separate from the system. And I could totally be reading this wrong. So
no, you're right. He has something else in mind. He's like, look, guys, you guys are trying to create a political society here, and what you're creating is like a group of like billiard balls that bounce off each other.
yeah,
and you guys are not like creating a cohesive society. You're creating a group of people that view themselves as individuals and not as a group of people. That's what your rights are doing to people, is like you're making sure that there's never any association that goes beyond self-interest.
the billiard balls is a really good metaphor for that. Thank you.
And this is directly, now I do have a question about the order of these things that you're
Yeah.
sharing us with, sharing this.
Mhm.
I'm seeing this as kind of another build on top of, because we just talked about how saying these things from on high, from a state or whatever, entrenches the idea that they exist in the universe.
Yeah, right.
And by doing that, we have now made ourselves billiard balls.
Yeah, we're sort of like slaves to this idea now.
And now we just believe that that's the way things are, is that we are
Yeah.
individual billiard balls.
Exactly.
When the truth is like we could all live in the same house or something. Like
Totally.
that, you know.
Yeah, that's
Well,
exactly right.
You could compare it to Eastern philosophy, right? Where
Yeah.
the heart of it is non-duality or interconnectedness to every living or every real material thing on this plane is connected, and that's the actual truth of the universe.
Right.
And all these things we make up with language and laws and capital and money
and rights
are just that made up. And so the interconnectedness is the thing we skip over when we decide that property actually exists, when interconnectedness is actually the thing that exists. Maybe. I don't know.
I love that. Yeah. I think that might explain why Marx was very popular in the East. You know, in some ways.
and it just keeps reminding me of that one joke also. I don't know who says it, but you know, like we came over and we were like, hey, we'll give you all these turkeys in exchange for this, if we can have this land or whatever. And then the native peoples were like, I don't know what have means, but sure.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And so like, yeah, so this is like why I like this particular passage. You know, it's not the one that like people think of when they think of Marx. Not passage like this, like Marx is writing this again. He's a very young man and he hasn't done his sort of critique of capitalism yet, but you can really tell where he's going. And it's just a really nice insight into like liberalism as sort of like distinct from you know, what he has in mind. And so to sort of sum up this idea, and then we can move on to like the last few ideas, is like Marx's critique of rights. And he has this to say about it. He says, none of the so-called rights of men go beyond the egoistic man, the man withdrawn into himself, his private interest, and his private choice, separated from the community as a member of civil society. So rights substitute the illusion for the reality of freedom, right? Rights presuppose that human beings are egoistic and competitive. They teach us to be distrustful and fearful of each other. They shrink and confine our lives to ourselves rather than expand and build our lives out to others. And then there's this really great turn of phrase here. He says, thus man was not freed from religion. And so this is after he's like described the sort of like how these rights came to be. And he says, thus man was not freed from religion, he received religious freedom. He was not freed from property, he received freedom of property. He was not freed from the egoism of trade, but received freedom to trade. And so again, I just really like this sort of like way of thinking. He's just like not engaging in the debate that we want him to have, maybe. Where he's like, don't tell us what, like tell us what's wrong with the egoism of trade. And he just sort of like says like, no, you got, it's like a really interesting way to sort of divert questions. And it like leaves the sort of person, the interlocutor, it leaves the person that he's speaking to, you know, like if you can imagine him as Socrates on the street or something like that, it leaves them questioning and wondering more and like not resolved. It leaves them like asking themselves questions as they go about their day. And I think that's a good thing to have, you know.
Right, like we keep defending shit he's not even attacking. You mean?
Yeah, precisely. It's like, you know, like most of the critiques against Marx that you hear, I think are against things that he doesn't have in mind, you know. For sure. And so like where does he end up? You guys have sort of already hinted at it. It sounds like he's critiquing capitalism, isn't he? Like, what does he want instead or something like that? And so he ends by saying this. He says, political emancipation is the reduction of man to a member of civil society, to an egoistic, independent individual on one hand, and to a citizen, a moral person on the other. We should unite these two things. Only when the actual individual, man, has taken back into himself the abstract citizen, and in his everyday life, his individual work and his individual relationships has become a species being, only when he has recognized and organized his own powers as social powers, so that the social force is no longer separated from him as political power, only then is human emancipation complete. And so if I could go back to like a previous slide, what he wants is the unification of the voting man and the civil society. But when we unify them, they will be different, because we're not going to be sort of pursuing the end result of our political pursuits are not going to be us working in the Amazon factory, right? We're going to be democratic in both our politics and in our economics. You know, we're going to be sort of like recognizing ourselves as a member of the whole, just as we are sort of unified as a whole. And so what are the main takeaways, right? The sort of summation of the article here. Number one, there's four. Number one, liberal capitalist freedom is atomistic, anti-communal, man as an isolated monad withdrawn into himself. The rights of man give us this sort of like isolation. Property is an antisocial, egoistic right of self-interest to find in other men not the realization, but the limitation of his own freedom. Number three, liberal capitalism makes a political community a means for preserving political rights, preserving property rights, rather than an end in itself. So the political community is not an end in itself under capitalism. It is a means for preserving property rights. The sphere in which man acts as a member of the community is degraded below that which he acts as a fractional being. So, you know, the folks that say that Marx is anti-political, that he like doesn't respect ideas of democracy or doesn't want us to be a political being, he doesn't sort of recognize the Aristotelian nature of man as a political animal. Marx is saying something quite different here. He's saying that like, no, there is a part of us that is political, and it's like neutered under liberal capitalism. It takes that part of ourselves and it isolates it. It puts it into a box and we bring it out every 2 years. And that's not like real, like that's not like fulfilling ourselves, right? And lastly, all emancipation is restoration of the human world and the relationships of men themselves. Only when man has recognized and organized his powers as social powers, only then is human emancipation complete. So another way to describe this is, yeah, abolishing capitalism, abolishing private property, abolishing this sort of relationship between the state and the economy, which results in the sort of production of private property, and the isolation of man from other man. So again, the objections are numerous, right? You guys have told me a few. I will list a couple, and then we'll talk about the sort of anti-Semitism thing. Objections are civil and political rights. They can be developed, can't they? You know, like it's not like the ones that we got from the French Revolution are it. Like we could sort of supplement them with economic and social rights, for example. We could do something like an economic bill of rights that might get us pretty close to what Marx has in mind, and it might sort of like shave off the hard edges of the things that he's worried about, right? Even such, he sort of fails to appreciate the value even of civil and political rights, you know, like there is something to be said about the French Revolution and the American Revolution as advancing the cause of human emancipation.
Did he outright like talk shit on those concepts, or he just ignored
Totally,
them?
you missed it unfortunately,
Oh,
but he doesn't.
got it.
It's
Sorry.
You'll just have to assume that it was rather convincing.
Okay.
It was pretty convincing, Howard. You did pretty good. You'd love it.
Okay.
It was just sort of thought provoking, I think. But so like he sort of fails to appreciate
Can you give
that,
me
that
like
they,
a 20-second TLDR? Sorry.
yeah,
for
they
everyone.
actually end up ensuring that that's the sort of limit of our ability to progress.
In the same vein of him saying that just by acknowledging private property in that statement,
That's right.
that like we're entrenching the concept when the concept should be
Yes.
abolished. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. That makes sense.
It's a very similar type of argument that he makes towards just the liberal rights of man. Just like this idea that like Yeah,
That
I
those
just
should
want
be
to
a
leave it at
given,
that.
and it shouldn't even be a concept that we have to discuss or talk about, kind of.
Yeah, and like it's more so that like when we say something like, okay, you are given freedom, we're going to make sure that you have freedom. It's a part of the Bill of Rights or whatever. What that freedom actually means when we look at the text, it just means that like you are free to be like an
To
isolated.
participate in this capitalist fucking disjointed, like non-communal society.
Yeah, he has in mind this idea that it separates us from each other. It makes us
Okay.
into these like isolated monads, is the words that
Yeah,
he used. It turns us into these beings that only conceive of ourselves as individuals.
got
And he
it.
thinks that rights do that.
It's
Rights do that. They concretize this idea. It puts us under a box that has one individual. These are his rights. These are our property rights. These are his, and so like it sort of just makes sure it ensures
got
that
it. Got
we
it.
cannot connect with each other on a separate level. So again, like I said, those critiques in mind, he does sort of fail to appreciate that that was an advancement. Even the sort of those rights as isolated monad, things like that, that was an advancement beyond a sort of like more fully dominated feudal life for like a peasant, for example, right? That was a sort of advancement. And so Marx sort of like, perhaps sweeps that part under the rug and says, but I will want to say, Marx's critique accurately targets some conceptions of rights. There certainly is this idea, like there's a dude I studied under who actually like really loves this idea. He's a really famous and well-respected law scholar. And he says things like, yeah, the legal system is sort of indebted to these ideas of rights, but they've sort of failed to sort of advance beyond a certain like 19th century idea of like where your rights begin
Dude,
and end.
so can we, okay, what was there, because I actually got to go in a second, but
We're about to be
that,
done.
okay, so that to me is like the crux of all this.
Mhm.
So like, okay, cool. Marx has these ideas. Some of them are a little bit foreign to me, like the obviously like the one that especially where he's talking about this idea that private property, that whole line of questioning
Mhm.
that we discussed, right? That's very, it's just very alien to me and repulsive, but okay.
Mhm.
But what you just said there, I think, is like the crux of it for me, where it's like we failed to advance past your legal friend. He said, okay,
Yeah.
cool, these civil ideas were cool, but we failed to advance past that.
Mhm.
That is like the underlying, I'm trying to figure out how to like articulate this. The opposite of that is my problem with all of this stuff. And what I mean by that is like, okay, cool. So let's say for a second that I suspend my disbelief and I say, yeah, you know what, Marx has some interesting ideas. Some of them are very like kind of like hard for me to conceptualize, perhaps because of my own upbringing and my worldview and so on and so forth. But like these are some interesting ideas, and I think he does get at some like existential struggles that I would say most human beings that have any level of self-awareness or introspection have at one point or another grappled with, right? Like the connection to others, like these greater sense of purpose, like the concepts that you've been talking about this whole class, right? These like these deeper questions about what's the purpose. But when I hold these ideas up to the light of history, of contemporary society, and not to sound pessimistic, of human nature,
Mhm.
right? It is so hard for me to shake the fact that, of the opposite of what your buddy said, which is that like we are not the collective consciousness of the aggregate human society is not in a place where any of these things are compatible with reality. And so as a result, we have a decidedly imperfect system in capitalism,
Mhm.
but which has provided so much advancement in quality of life, in equity, in equality, and even with all of its warts and issues and inherent, shortcomings, that when attempted all of these concepts that Marx is beginning to lay the framework for in these admittedly preliminary conversations that we're having about his ideas have failed to do. And I just keep coming back to that as much as I'll like sit here and I'll pause and I'll listen to you and I'll be like, oh, huh, like that's actually an interesting idea. Or okay, like that's not so fucking abhorrent to me. Like that's you know that okay, maybe I don't really vibe with that one, but like no, that makes sense, right? But I keep coming back to that. I'm like, none of
Yeah.
this fucking matters because in real life it doesn't work.
Totally.
You know what I mean? It's
That's
nonsense.
that's a frustration that that many students have, not only of Marx, but of almost anybody that you encounter in a class like this. I usually attribute it to like a failure of like the ability to abstract. And I don't mean that, I'm not trying to like talk shit to you, but like,
No,
but
please,
I
please.
really do sort of think that like on some level, there's like a student that like comes to a class like this and it gets so frustrated because they're like, I'm a political scientist. I want to talk about like
Real shit.
like the laws that are on the books and like
Yeah,
who's going to win the next election. What is all this
yeah,
about? What is this? This is nonsense. And there's
yeah.
like that frustration and there's like that inability to sort of bridge. It's like a Tower of Babel, I think,
Sure.
really. And I just really sort of think that it's like a distinction between like what you're trying to get out of like discussing something like this. We're not really here like, as Marx would say, he's not interested in like coming up with the recipe of the cook shops of the future. That's like a very famous Marxian phrase. He's not doing like actual like state building, you know? Perhaps it was a mistake to sort of read him as doing that, which is what some people did, right? What he wants us to do is expand our minds, right? And like think about, like critique the world around us. And to use another phrase, do a ruthless critique of everything existing. Like find out what the contradictions are going on, because we might get closer to something like human emancipation by
See, it's interesting
having a
because
closer idea. Yeah.
when you put it like that, I'm like, okay, cool. That I can fuck with that. I think there's a lot of value there. I guess it's just yeah, I mean, I think maybe we save this
It's
next
really
piece for
frustrating. I know it's frustrating. And there will be better times. Like we're actually going to talk about like next week we'll do historical materialism. We will literally talk about capitalism turning into socialism and what that looks like for Marx. And like,
I totally feel you for what it's worth. I can't tell you how many times I went to my philosophy professor and be like, dude, what the fuck does any of this fucking matter?
Yeah.
At all? You know what I mean? Like, what the fuck? Like,
Yeah.
what do I do with this information?
Yeah.
You know?
yeah,
And like, I don't know. For me, Marx, granted, I don't agree with Marx's solutions, but I think Marx's sentiment and his questions here are really valid towards the human experience. You know, and like I'll definitely that's what I take away from it mostly. And like I think Brian's right that allows us to question our place in the system of the bigger things a little bit better with new ideas or with more empathy maybe towards something we're struggling with or not struggling with, regardless of the solution they propose. Like, so I guess it's like the value of Marx specifically to me, or maybe just the value of any thinker in general. Like, is it about their solution or is it about the questions that they raise? And like, it's to me, it's more about the questions that they raise than it is to the solution that they propose. And so for me, I had to reconcile that with this a value. Like, what am I valuing more from these thinkers? Is it that they actually solve something, or is it that they are questioning and possibly answering something that I too have struggled with, or I too have questioned, and they
Sure.
may have put words to feelings that people have.
sure. Yeah, no, and I think no, that makes a lot of sense, dude. And I think Brian kind of nailed it in that, like, I do struggle with the abstraction, 100%. Like, it's very hard for me to expend mental energy like dealing with just abstraction for abstraction's sake. But I hear you, Jeff, in that, like, yeah, like if and even you, Brian, right, in the context of looking at Marx as a challenge, as a devil's advocate to the status quo, dude, for sure there's fucking value in that. And I'll even admit that, like, some of not all of, you know, I'm not gonna go full bore. Like and I'm not even saying that to like be a shit kicker. I really just don't. I don't think all of them are there. But like, but some of the ideas for sure are like, okay, that's interesting. Um, but I'm just like, yeah, no, actually, it's no rebuttal. Yeah, that makes sense in that context and through that lens. I think it's at the very least, it's an interesting conversation to have. You know.
Yeah, keep bringing them up, man. The next couple weeks, I think there's going to be more ground to disagree with and things like that. But
Hey, Brian, real
Yeah.
quick, one last question.
Sure.
You brought up this idea, and I just want to, something just kind of clicked for me through the like this idea. I had a very different experience of this class where like I thought it was like profound how perfectly this dude from 200 years ago's like the way how perfectly he is describing my experience of my current political world around me
yeah.
is like so in line with what I see around me.
Mhm.
And the idea of concretizing and reifying is like a really profound idea to me.
Yeah.
And I remember at one point you were writing a paper, or you had this idea about how the way in which the media and advertisements, and maybe even like the way academia speaks about climate change,
Mhm.
concretizing and reifying the imminent death of our planet. Or is that, am I connecting those? Was that thought that you had derived from that idea
Yeah.
here, where like is that what you were trying to say in that fucking paper that I read one time?
No, I don't think
Is that
so.
what that was about? Okay,
No,
all right.
but like there was an element of like we are still gonna be alive on a planet that like is is altered, you know. I think I was after
Okay.
that paper was about despair. I ended up having Marx has been profoundly
Okay, I just, that
influential.
clicked for me. I was like, oh, maybe.
Yeah, I don't think that that's what I was on about, but
Okay.
that's an interesting idea. But yeah,
Oh,
but
okay,
the
never mind.
concretizing and
That's just what I thought. I was like, oh, maybe that's where you got that idea.
but concretizing and reifying is like in my head all the time. Yeah, I think about that all the time. Gramsci is the guy that coined the term hegemony, and that's
Who?
that's an Antonio Gramsci, and he's a guy that sort of like brought that idea, the idea of like reifying, into the sort of like modern discourse. Because what he talks about, he talks about capitalism becoming hegemonic and like, you know, like giving us our dreams, you know, like investing into us, our, you know, our, what we think of ours as our personhood. And like, there is no alternative to it. And like, such that we willingly submit to it, you know, we love it. We love our
Yeah.
iPhones, you know? And so like, that was like, yeah. Anyway, so like, let's end by like, just sort of like bringing the anti-Semitism out to light. So like everything I told you so far was what was there, but then there's this sort of second part of the paper. I basically told you about the first half. The second half,
Oh,
Marx has in what he has in mind as the target now is Jews, and Judaism, and what he means by this is he means capitalism. And so this is what I have to say about it. He says like in the second part of the essay, Marx goes on to criticize the economic relations and attitudes characteristic of civil society, characteristic of that Amazon sweatshop factory picture that I had, right? He criticizes the economic relations and attitudes in a manner typical with his time. He identifies those attitudes and economic relations with stereotypes of Jews, right? And some have seen these as evidence of Marx's own anti-Semitism, right? And so he says things like this. He says like, the Jew has emancipated himself in a Jewish way, not only by acquiring financial power, but also because with and without him, money has become a world power. And the practical Jewish spirit has become the practical spirit of Christian nations. The Jews have emancipated themselves insofar as the Christians have become Jews. And so again, you could sort of interject capitalist or capitalism into here when he says Jews. That's really what he's saying. And so that's obviously a pretty horrible, horrible trope. But he's saying that, you know, like capitalism has, i.e. Judaism, has become the sort of world religion in such that we all sort of, you know, pursue moneyed interest and things like that, right? And he says, what is the secular basis of Judaism? Practical need, self-interest. What is the worldly cult of the Jew? Huckstering. This is like the close. This is as close.
Jesus Christ.
This is as close
Holy
as Marx
shit.
gets to as, like, he doesn't use the word
Jeez.
capitalism yet. He doesn't use the word capitalism, but he says huckstering, which is like,
Bro, so the dude was just fucking blatantly anti-Semitic.
Yeah, just really gnarly anti-Semitic. I have no
Totally.
You know, we could.
it's totally so. Yeah,
Ugh.
emancipation from bargaining and money, and thus from practical and real Judaism, would be the self-emancipation of our era. The social emancipation of the Jew is the emancipation of society from Judaism. So again, you know, he's exploiting anti-Semitic imagery and rhetoric, right? Some would say, and I think I say this more often than not, his real target is civil society and ultimately capitalism, not Jews
Yeah.
per se.
Okay, that's fine, but like you can't, like, he's conflating the
He's
two.
naming his
Like,
culprit.
Of
they're-
course.
Yeah, like, so whether or not you want
He's
to like
like-
hide
he's
behind
like-
that, bro, like, let's get real.
Yeah, yeah.
But
I
dude-
mean, I agree with you, Brian, but like he's basically saying like murder is bad, and these people are the main type of people who do.
Yeah. So
Totally.
like, okay, cool. Even if we agree that murder is bad, like, you can't fucking just say that. Yeah.
It's not great. He, if it helps at all, he goes on and has the rest of his career writing most of his more important works, more influential works, and he never ever gets back to this type of language ever.
Yeah, because he probably got, you know,
Well,
somebody,
no, that's
somebody
the
was
idea.
like,
Is that
hey, bro,
he could-
whoa.
you could write this sort of thing at the time, and everybody was fine because like everybody was
Thread the
on this
needle.
level. So anyway, so I
Yeah.
don't want to sort of like I'm bringing this up not to defend him, but like to sort of bring it out into the light. This is what was said. in the
Kind
paper.
of sounds like you're defending him a little
Well,
bit.
I just want to give you all the sort of like, this is what is said about this, you know. It is used, so people use this as sort of evidence. They say like, look, Marx was an anti-Semite, we should throw him out.
Well, you want to know what's interesting to give? I don't know if this like gives points to the left or more so it just kind of like discredits the right a little bit. Is that like, for all of the anti-Marxist rhetoric that I like hear and read on a regular basis, it's almost like none of them have studied him enough to even like throw this one in the ring, because
Oh
I've
yeah,
never,
of course. Yeah.
I've never even heard this brought up, and I'm like, here's your slam dunk to like shut his shit down. The dude's a fucking, you know, he's a Hitler wannabe. He hates the Jews, but they don't even bring that shit up.
I
So it's pretty
mean,
obvious.
Howard,
they've never even,
maybe
like-
this is your moment, dude. You know, this
Dude,
is your
straight up,
alley oop,
this
Howard.
is-
You're
this is
standing
my-
at the
this is
goal
my
line,
platform.
you know. And
You're right.
I will
Yeah,
tell you
Brian's
what will
tossing it in.
happen. I will tell you what will happen to you is you will get a bunch of people saying, this is a very a surface level reading of the piece if you think he's actually like after the Jews here. It's more that he's after the sort
No,
of
I get it. You already
Jewishness.
explained that. You explained that.
People
No,
will
no,
say
look,
that to you.
Dude, no, 100%. Do I
Okay.
think that Marx is Hitler and he made it his mission to go kill the Jews? No, I think that the way that Maverick phrased it is correct. It's exactly what Maverick said. The dude's a fucking racist, and what he was trying to get at was a lot more than just the fact that he's a racist, but like he didn't even try to disguise his racism.
I'm not
You
sure
can't
that's what.
ignore it.
I'm
yeah.
not sure those are the words I used, but
I agree,
yeah.
Howard. You
The way-
can't ignore it, and so I'm not. You know that's like the
Sure,
idea.
no, but that's okay. I mean, it's not okay that he's a racist, but like it doesn't. He has some interesting ideas that I think are worth discussing independently of his.
I
of his-
maybe
All right,
you know because
I'm
his
gonna
other
say it.
idea- maybe because
Bro,
Yes, what's
fuck,
up?
there's spilt water everywhere. All right, I have, and I do not. I'm regurgitating views that are not my own here, so I need to preface with that. But I have heard these same remarks from plenty of people in regards to work ethic and laziness, and proponents to comparing Black people as lazy, and
Dude,
they love
hell yeah,
Mexicans
Jeff.
because they're hardworking. And I don't think that's far fucking off from what Marx is doing here. You know what I mean?
Good job. Hell
In
yeah,
the
dude.
same
Love that.
fucking ethic that like people are like, well, I don't like Black people because they're lazy, but I love Mexicans because they work fucking hard. You know what I mean? I think it's exactly what Marx is doing here with the Jews
Totally.
to say, like, I fucking hate capitalism, and Jews represent that. So I'm not agreeing with Marx or the other people. I'm just saying, like I think we are experiencing that same rhetoric today in regards to like this bootstrap fucking mentality of the US.
I agree.
So
That's fair. Yeah, no, I agree with that for sure.
Critical
I agree with
support
that.
to that idea. I
Yeah.
can wrap things up right now, and I'll just say, so
I got a
next
jet,
week,
you guys.
yeah,
I
next
gotta- I
week
gotta
is
sign
a
off.
tour of Marx's theory of history. We're going to talk about historical materialism. We're gonna cover a lot of ground up to and including parts of the Communist Manifesto. I think we'll have to save most of the Communist
Cool.
Manifesto for the following week. But anyway, that's all. Thank you guys.
Good
that was a lot
shit.
of fun. Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Thank
guys.
you,
Have a
Brian.
good
Thank
night.
you,
Great class, Brian.
Brett,
Thanks,
I'll
Brian.
send you a link to next
Thank you,
week.
Howard.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks,
See
brother.
ya.
Thanks, Howard. Thanks, Howard. Thank you, Howard.